I don't think there really is any argument that can be made against the fact that Motörhead is one of, if not the most influential band in the heavy metal punk rock history. Since their conception in 1975, Lemmy Kilmister has marched on with a chip on his shoulder, showing the world how rock and roll is done. Motörhead has influenced hundreds of bands over the past several decades, from 80s legends like Metallica to Sepultura, to more contemporary acts like Bewitcher and Midnight. Many of the bands we all love wouldn't be the way they were without Motörhead. And although their influence is unchallenged, the question of what is their best album often comes up. When you ask someone what their favorite Motörhead album is, the go-to answers are usually Overkill and Ace of Spades. And for good reason. They're fast, sleazy, and capture the morals that Lemmy had set out for the band. And in defense of the latter, it especially played a huge role in consolidating the punk rock and heavy metal subcultures. Many rockers and fans cite them as their favorites, and they are uncontestably two of the most influential albums of all time. With all that being said, I feel like Motörhead has released music that stands alongside those two in the terms of quality, and in some cases, I would personally argue that I like more. This is not me saying that these two albums don't deserve the flowers or the reputation that they have, as they are two of the most important albums of all time. And if I were to rank Motörhead's entire discography, they're both just outside of my top 5, but there are others that I do think deserve just as much recognition. And as such, I thought it would be fun tonight to kind of talk about why I like those albums and why I think they deserve more praise. And before I get into this, I do just want to say that this is in no way me saying that these two can't not or should not be your favorite album. They are phenomenal releases, and I completely understand why people love them so much. However, I think that Motörhead has released albums that are just as good, and I think it's cool to talk about them. And the first album that I'm going to talk about tonight is the sixth studio release from Motörhead, and that is Another Perfect Day. I was debating which 80s album I was going to talk about in this video, and it was either going to be Orgasmatron or Another Perfect Day, as I think both albums are phenomenal, and I do probably like more both than Overkill and Ace of Spades. But I decided to go with Another Perfect Day because I feel like Orgasmatron does have a bit more of a cult following. And I did ask some people, and a good amount of them said that Orgasmatron is actually one of their favorites. So for the sake of this video, I will talk about Another Perfect Day. After a successful run of 3 albums, the classic Motörhead lineup of Lemmy, Eddie Clarke, and Phil Taylor would take its first hit, as Clarke would resign from the band as a result of tension from working with Wendy O. Williams of the Plasmatics, resulting in Motörhead hiring Brian Robertson of Thin Lizzy to fill in on guitar. Despite early tension, touring with Robertson went well and all seemed to be fine. However, Brian's outlandish fashion sense and his refusal to play famous Motörhead songs would cause tension within the band, which Lemmy recalled as the lowest point of their career. This resulted in not only an uncharacteristic product on stage, but an uncharacteristic album for Motörhead. Another Perfect Day was released in May 1983 and encompassed a different sound than prior releases. If Overkill and Ace of Spades were more dirty and gritty, Another Perfect Day had a more polished and clean feel to it. At least as polished and clean as you can get with Motörhead. The inclusion of Brian Robertson pushed the band towards a more progressive sound, as Robertson's background called for a lighter atmosphere on the album. As a result, the album was a massive departure than what was seen on previous releases, which resulted in mixed emotions and reception from fans and critics. Lemmy recounts that many saw the album as commercial or as a sellout album, resulting in many fans turning away from the album and the band upon its release. Despite Lemmy thinking the music on the album and Brian Robertson himself were great musically, he conceded that the lengthy and frustrating recording process with Robertson was not what Motörhead needed at the time, and as a result of the cynical nature surrounding this album, it's often overlooked when compared to the rest of the 80s catalog. However, I think Another Perfect Day is one of the strongest albums because of the reasons it was so overlooked, and that is Brian Robertson. The influence that Robertson had on it just makes it so unique and gives it both a sound and emotion that I don't think any other Motörhead album really has. Contrary to the fist in your face openers of albums prior, Another Perfect Day opens with a really nice guitar twindle before Lemmy's bass gets things moving. And this more laid back, soft guitar opening appears on other tracks, including the title track. Brian wanted to ensure that his touch was left on the album, as Lemmy claimed that Brian wanted to be seen as the guy from Thin Lizzy who stepped in to save Motörhead, as opposed to an actual Motörhead band member. Dancing on Your Grave, One Track Mind, and Marching Off to War are all good examples of this, as I feel the guitar sounds are a little more fleshed out and explored compared to previous releases, and the solos seemed more extensive. Throughout the album, songs like Shine and Rocket present sounds and melodies that are a little more tame than previous Motörhead releases, but still deliver that classic sound, if not in a little more avant way. And I especially love the piano-esque sound found in the latter. And the balance that Lemmy's bass gives Die You Bastards is a really nice little rhythm, and I think it was a cool way to close the album. I understand that the sounds and style of Another Perfect Day isn't for everybody, especially those who prefer the more stripped down and rough sound of Motörhead, but I think that Another Perfect Day has aged extraordinarily well, and I think it is one of the most unique sounding albums in Motörhead's entire discography, for better or for worse. The next album that I'm going to talk about is arguably one of their most commercially successful albums, and that is 1916. 1916 was one of the first albums on WTG Records after Lemmy's move to Los Angeles, and it is often revered by both the bands and the fans as one of their strongest outputs. I feel like this reputation is earned for two reasons, with the first being that the variation of songs all work together and don't outshine one another despite their differences. The album opens with a thunderous ensemble of drums, with the one to sing the blues capturing the war theme and setting a proper tone that is carried throughout the album. You have your typical fast-paced rockers like Going to Brazil and No Voices in the Sky, with the latter of which being featured on Beavis and Butthead, while also having more experimental and paced tracks like Nightmare, Dreamtime, and the title track. 1916 is a Motörhead track like no other, featuring synthesizers and a much softer and more vulnerable sounding Lemmy, as he sings of how soldiers will fight and die in war, only for their names to be forgotten throughout the march of time. The other reason why I think this album has aged so well is because of the risks it took at the time while not really deviating from the Motörhead formula. Lemmy recounts that Motörhead was never trying to change, it was just something that kind of happened naturally with the relocation and a new label. Everything a fan would expect from Motörhead is there, from the music to the lyrics, but there's also a sense of maturity and growth throughout the album, and I feel like it's because of songs like Love Me Forever and 1916. And that's not me trying to dismiss the rockers. Lemmy's voice sounds the best in his entire career on this album, and it shines on songs like No Voices in the Sky. The shorter and faster songs like I'm So Bad and Ramones are also a ton of fun, with the latter being a phenomenal tribute that the Ramones themselves hold in high regard. The only issue that I think I really have with this album is the obvious oversight on the album art, which is something Lemmy pointed out in his book, and that is the fact that several flags that should be on here are excluded. Obviously, you can include every single country that fought in World War I on an album cover, but I feel like France and Russia are two countries that should have been some of the first ones drawn on. Apart from that though, I do think that 1916 is one of Motörhead's best albums in their entire discography, and I am tempted to say it is my #1 favorite. The songs are strong and fast while also being heartfelt and imposing, and it does so without sacrificing any attitude that Motörhead had developed throughout their career. 1916 is a phenomenal album, and I am happy that it got the commercial recognition that it deserves. As far as commercial recognition goes with Motörhead, they really didn't get very far. After a failed attempt at following up 1916 with arguably the worst album of their career, March or Die, I feel like Motörhead was able to release an album that cemented the legacy that they are known by today of being fast, loud, obnoxious, and the album that they released that did so is so poetically and eloquently titled Bastards. With a new lineup, new producers, new label, but the same Motörhead attitude, Motörhead would put out their first album on German label ZYX Music and would look to remove the albatross from their reputation that was the butchered March or Die. And despite the limited promotion outside of Germany, I think they accomplished just that through the album of some of their fastest and loudest and most recognizable tracks. The two most famous songs off this album are Born to Raise Hell, which is exactly about what the title suggests, and Don't Let Daddy Kiss Me, a song focusing on child abuse. The latter of which was initially offered by Lemmy to female artists such as Joan Jett and Lita Ford, but many of them declined on the basis that the lyrical content was too close to home. And as such, Lemmy made sure that upon release that the song was taken seriously and devoid of any type of humor or crassness you would expect from Motörhead, apart from immediately being followed up by Bad Woman on the album, but we're not going to talk about that. The majority of tracks have the older, fast-paced Motörhead formula combined with the newer aggressiveness and polish of 1916. Burner is one of their fastest and loudest songs that would set a metal tone that the later albums such as Sacrifice and We Are Motörhead would look to continue. Death or Glory, a favorite of Lemmy's, opens with a blaze of gunfire-like drumming that mixes perfectly with the lyrics of a soldier's reincarnation throughout history. Bad Woman features pianos that add a fun, bluesy feel to the song that doesn't detract from the attitude, although as I mentioned, putting out one right after Don't Let Daddy Kiss Me may have been a bit of an oversight. Or maybe Lemmy was just trying to be offensive. I wouldn't put it past him. Liar is also a highlight, featuring a very pissed off and angry sounding Lemmy, lamenting over those who screwed him over, which was topical for the time as Motörhead had dealt with numerous accounts of bullshit from record companies and executives. Despite the limited promotion and recognition for Motörhead at the time as a result of Bastards' release, the album to this day is still revered as one of Motörhead's best over time, and I think that's exactly the legacy that should be left for the band. They did exactly what they wanted, and despite limited success at the time, their legacy as a no bullshit, take no prisoners band had been cemented, and I think that all traces back to Bastards. And since Bastards, Motörhead only got faster, louder, and heavier. There were many good releases since 1993, such as Sacrifice, We Are Motörhead, and Inferno, and I think all of these deserve more love they get. However, the album that has been one of my favorites ever since I got into heavy music back in high school is the 2008 release Motorizer. There isn't really too much to say about Motorizer that can't be said about the other Motörhead albums of this era. It's fast and loud, much like many other Motörhead releases at this time, and lyrically it's about war, rocking out, fighting, and women. So why do I like this one so much? In my personal opinion, this is the loud Motörhead album. This is the one that I play so loud in the car to the point where if my dad were there, he would tell me to get out of the driver's seat and get my sorry ass in the back. Lemmy is known for his gravelly voice, and on Motorizer, he makes sure everyone listening can hear it. Unlike 1916 or Bastards, there really isn't any point in the album where the volume lowers or the band goes experimental. There are slower songs like Heroes, but nothing that wouldn't have you banging your head and pounding your Jack Daniels. I also do want to touch upon the fact that over time bands get older and they start to slow down and release music that solely sells itself on being in the catalog of a legacy band. Sometimes veteran music can be incredible and show that age doesn't impact quality. Other times, not so much. Lemmy was in his early 60s at the time of this release, and if nothing else, I think that Motorizer shows that despite his age, there was no question that Motörhead could put out an album that stood amongst the releases of the time that people would consider their prime. I think the overall attitude of Motorizer is Lemmy saying that he knows he's old, he knows that his music, the way it sounds, is dated, he knows he's not getting any younger, and he could still kick your favorite frontman's ass if he needed to. I also think it loses some of the intensity and melancholy from previous releases like Kiss of Death and Inferno, and opts for a more upbeat, I love rock and roll vibe. And whether or not that's the right call or a good thing is subjective, but I always think life is a little bit better when you're smiling as opposed to being pissed off. Teach You How to Sing the Blues is one of my favorite Motörhead tracks, and I don't really have any explanation why, apart from the last verse is so goddamn catchy, and it makes me smile every time I hear it. The Thousand Names of God is also one of the best album closers in the entire Motörhead catalog, and despite the majority of the lyrics on this album being crass and juvenile, I think it was a pretty good call to end the album on a more poetic note. And this doesn't mean that those juvenile lyrics are to be overlooked. Buried Alive and Runaround Man are loads of fun and really remind me of those sunset drives when I was living in Los Angeles. And of course, no one can forget the neck-snapping Rock Out, which is one of my favorite songs of all time. I understand that with a new release, it's not going to be remembered as diverse or influential or anything like that, and I understand why people prefer stuff like Ace of Spades to it, but to me, Motorizer will always be the album that reminds me of why Motörhead is one of my favorite bands. It's fun, upbeat, and shows that sometimes the formula a band has stuck to doesn't have to change to be good. Motorizer maintains the identity that Motörhead had built for itself up to that point, and it only helps immortalize that identity for years to come. And there you have it, a few Motörhead albums that I personally enjoy a little bit more than some of the ones that are considered their most popular. And again, this is not me saying that you can't like popular things or me trying to say that I'm different for liking an album that doesn't have as much celebration. I'm just coming at this from a perspective of a Motörhead fan who has listened to a good amount of their discography, and I feel like some albums that may not get celebrated as much deserve a little bit more love. And these are the reasons why. When you have a discography of over 20 studio albums, it's very easy for songs to be overlooked, especially when they are compared to great songs like Ace of Spades, Love Me Like a Reptile, and Stay Clean. But I've always felt that Lemmy Kilmister and Motörhead's legacy should be defined by more than just a few hits. And although many like to say that Motörhead is just a one-trick pony and a lot of their songs sound the exact same, I think a lot of these albums, amongst others that I didn't really get to talk about tonight, prove otherwise and show that Lemmy Kilmister was much more than just a one-dimensional guy playing a few strings. And whether or not it's just for a couple of songs or for an entire 22 studio album discography, Lemmy Kilmister will forever be remembered as one of the greatest bassists of all time. Thank you guys for hanging out with me tonight, and as always, rock out.